Hi, I'm Amy. I got an A star on my A Level History, and in today's History Explained video, we're going to be looking at Henry VIII Society as part of the Part 1 Consolidation of the Tudor Dynasty Tudor A Level AQA course. We'll start the video by having a little look at the part of the specification this video will cover, before moving on to the content, looking at division of society under Henry VIII, development of the putting out system, religious upheaval, poor law, urban and rural change, before moving on to having a look at the rebellions. We'll also make sure to have a look at the past paper questions, potential questions that could come up on this topic. The notes on your screen are part of a revision notes pack available on the History Explained website at historyexplained.co.uk, alongside many other resources, including essay plans, flashcards, webinar sign up, past paper questions, and handwritten extract questions for the Tudor paper. So let's get into it. So let's start having a look at some potential essay questions that could come up on Henry VIII society. So we could look at a question like, English society was transformed between 1509 and 1547, assess the validity of this view. The dissolution of the monasteries was the most significant cause of rebellion in the years 1509 to 1547. Or religious changes were the most significant changes to take place in the years 1509 to 1547, assess the validity of this view. Now, you might notice that for the second two questions, society isn't explicitly mentioned in the terms of the question. In this case, society instead offers quite a useful opportunity to focus one of your paragraphs on and think about how change has impacted society. So let's have a look at what society looked like under Henry VIII. Now, society was broadly structured in the same way as it had been under Henry VII. Things had not changed an awful lot in this time. The monarch sat at the top of a great chain of being, and this social order was largely said to be natural and God-given. Famously, the king is based on the divine right of kings, and everything follows beneath him. Status was mostly derived from birth, land ownership, and service to the crown. Now, as this section unfolds, ensure that you think about how society was changing under the reign of Henry VIII, comparing it to how it looked under Henry VII. This could give you points to help you structure your answer about the extent of change of society and the economy in this period. Think about how this content might help you analyse significance and impact of changes in government. So here society offers you an opportunity to kind of think more in depth about changes in foreign policy, the economy and government, and think about how things are really impacting people's everyday lives. So before we really get into it, let's have a quick think about what social history actually is. Now, this might be something you've covered a little bit in your coursework preparations, but if not, social history is a historical study of how people lived, with a particular focus on looking beyond narratives that overemphasize elite histories. It examines how political, economic, and religious change affected different groups within society. Unlike political history, it focuses on lived experience, not just the power and decision-making. Now, social history helps us examine aspects of various social, political, and economic changes, and should help us reveal the varied ways in which change and continuity were actually experienced. Now, this is relevant for all periods of history, but obviously it's particularly important for Tudor history, where a lot of our focus is on the Tudors, the monarchs, the nobles, and the people who were in power. But also living through the Tudor dynasty was everybody else. So this gives us an opportunity to have a bit of an insight about what life was like for them. Now, it's this frame of thinking that can really help you build nuance into your essay answer and really push for those level 4 and level 5 marks. Particularly when we're thinking about topics like rebellion, thinking about society can help us understand elements of continuity and change. So let's start by having a little look at the development of the putting out system. The putting out system had begun to emerge under Henry VII, but really took shape under Henry VIII. Now, this was a system that really took over cloth-making regions, and it was the process by which merchants would arrive in England and they would bring raw wool or partially processed cloth to rural households and pay people within the home, this is mostly women and children, to finish the cloth making. So they would turn the raw product or the partially finished product into ready-made cloth, ready for the merchants to then come, collect and sell. This worked out to be the cheapest and most profitable way of making cloth. And as the demand for cloth grew, merchants increasingly sought the cheaper production that this method awarded them. This created incomes for people living in the countryside and helped families maintain a decent standard of living, giving work for women and children, and supporting household bills. Now, this was not necessarily the primary way that most rural people got by, but the growth of this system was an important industrial shift and created a new workspace within the home. A core thing to note about the putting out system is that it had quite an asymmetric impact, as it disproportionately offered income to cloth-making regions. So these are regions near ports that have the opportunity to welcome in merchants. Now, thinking about the impact of the putting out system could help you complicate an essay thinking about a kind of social crisis in this period during periods of economic depression. Instead, this provides an insight into the ways that people were able to make money and support their income independently and separate to the economic crises going on around Britain in this period. Now, in a previous video, we've looked at religious change in England in this period, but if we have a little look back and think about it, the split from the Catholic Church in the early 1530s had a massive impact on England and life for the majority of people in England. The Act of Supremacy required all clergy to take an oath to the king, who became the new supreme head of the Church of England, and people were expected to change their religious practice from Catholic to Protestantism. Alongside this came the dissolution of the monasteries. Now, the monasteries had previously been real centres of local community. They provided a space for not only religious worship and religious ritual, but they were spaces for education, they were spaces for ceremony, they were spaces for charity, and they were also significant landlords. The monasteries and the church owned a significant portion of the land in England at this time. So a lot of everyday people's lives revolved around the church, around their parish, around their monastery. Now, with the dissolution of the monasteries, obviously this was entirely bulldozed. People's lives were really torn apart by this. And as a result, it did create a lot of social unrest and disruption to the social order. Now, here we have a brief timeline of the dissolution. This is quite helpful for thinking about how this change is being implemented legislatively. So from 1535, we see the Valor Ecclesiasticus, which was a survey of church wealth ordered by Cromwell, which provided a financial and administrative basis for reform. Then from 1536, we start to see the dissolution of the lesser monasteries, so smaller monastic houses worth under £200 are shut down. This was justified by claims of corruption, which was a common criticism of the Catholic Church at this point. By 1539, we see the dissolution of the greater monasteries. So all remaining religious houses were closed down and enforced by pressure and threat. By 1540, almost all religious houses were shut and monastic land and wealth had been transferred to the Crown. Now, this was a cause of major social tension and intensified regional divisions, where we see in the north a much stronger Catholic belief compared to the south or the southeast. And so we start to see tension building, especially in these places where their lives are even more disrupted by this countenance to their own theology. With this said, it is important to note that despite this massive religious upheaval and legislative change, the ways in which people really practiced their religion and what they believed obviously did not change all that much. Although the clergy were forced to take oaths, general people were mostly able to kind of maintain their beliefs relatively in secret and keep practicing the religion that they themselves believed. Here we have a breakdown of different stratas of society and how they experienced religious upheaval. So if we start with the clergy, ultimately senior members of the clergy actually benefited from the change, but only after swearing loyalty to the crown and being celebrated by the king. Others that were less keen on welcoming changes lost influence, or at worst were accused of treason and executed. Lesser senior members of the clergy who lived and worked in the monasteries were given a pension and often returned to secular life, apart from some men who were able to become priests. Many of those who returned to secular life struggled to reintegrate. Now, these are people who've spent their entire lives as monks or nuns, living in monasteries, living in nunneries. So obviously this is going to be a very difficult transition to suddenly not be doing what your life's purpose has been. Now, for the nobility and gentry, many members of nobility and gentry benefited greatly from the dissolution of land. Because the gentry had a lot to gain by all this new land and wealth being open, they were often the enforcers of reform and gained greater administrative responsibility and power over localities. Now, for rural communities who made up most of the population, they lost their cultural centres and religious change was experienced as social upheaval. The total crossover of religious life and social life means that this level of disruption affected every area of their life. The dissolution of the monasteries also stripped communities of the sites that had previously been central to providing community care and acted as employment hubs. Now, obviously, you can't describe the kind of rural population, the rural communities, the general population of England at this point as having had only one experience. There will have been variations to this. Different people will have responded differently, but overall, the overarching view is that life was severely disrupted. Occasionally, maybe it was disrupted for the better, people who really did hold Protestant beliefs, people who were able to gain new employment through the changes. However, for the majority of people, life got a lot more complicated. Now, if you look at urban communities, towns were still governed by guilds, meaning the decline of the church power was somewhat less significant to the governance of them. So the guild is the kind of industrial structure and training system by which people lived. It was about work, less about religion. However, the urban poor became increasingly visible as they could no longer take shelter in monastic houses or almshouses that were led by the church. Now, this disruption of almshouse and charity mostly impacted the poor and the vulnerable. So both in the countryside and in towns, the poor and the vulnerable were most impacted by changes as they lost access to the sites that had housed and cared for them for many, many years. Legislative changes did shift the responsibility to local parishes, but the structures and the funds weren't there in the same way as they had been before. So poverty remained widespread and became an increasing problem in England at this time. Now, as mentioned before, when we're thinking about religious change and the impact of religious change on the broader population, we have to think about the north-south divide. The north of England was significantly less economically developed than the south and the Midlands. The population was significantly more sparse and there were far fewer towns. Therefore, royal administration was far less present and nobles had much more power within local structures. The north was still strongly attached to traditional Catholic practices and relied on monasteries for charity, employment and social stability. So the dissolution of the monasteries had a particularly profound impact on the north. It had an impact everywhere, but when we're thinking about the kind of asymmetry of impact, we can think about the north as a particular case study. Now, as a revision tip, religious upheaval is a key area of evidence in regards to measuring social change in this period. It's important to pay attention to how change was varied and uneven to make your answers more nuanced. This could provide you with content for a counterpoint for an essay. The dissolution of the monasteries represented a turning point for the whole of England, accessibility of this view. Focus there on the whole of England. Geography played an important part in how religious change was experienced. The experience of somebody living in rural northern England versus urban southern England was entirely different. Now, some historians have brought forward the idea of the oppositional thesis. They argue that social tensions that bubbled away during the reign of Henry VIII led to the emergence of a discontented class amongst the lower orders of society. It is thought that this group was increasingly rebellious and hostile to the Tudor state. This theory is known as the oppositional thesis and is often brought up in relation to the Pilgrimage of Grace, which will be discussed below. The thesis is often contested, and although it is argued that this group did not form a coherent revolutionary class, instead the discontent was fragmented. Whether or not you agree with this thesis is up to you, but it's quite interesting to think of this period of rebellion as something kind of tied to a bit of a class consciousness. This increase in social upheaval led to a kind of common experience of oppression and common experience of decline amongst the people. And perhaps that could be an explainer for why rebellion became such a prominent feature of England at this point. But we'll get on to rebellion in a little bit. First, let's have a quick look at the Poor Law of 1536. Now, this was the first attempt of the Tudor state to regulate poor relief. Key element of the law was that it placed responsibility on local parishes to support the poor that lived there, which meant that local officials began encouraging the locals to donate towards poor relief. This process was overseen by the justices of the peace. The distinction was made up between deserving and undeserving, where the sick and elderly were entitled to help, while able-bodied beggars were discouraged and punished. Previously, under the operation of the monasteries, aid was not differentiated in this way. So this is a new trickle-down structure that's been created by the legislators of the government and now enforced on a local level. Now, when it happens this way, it's also important to remember that enforcement of something like this is going to be happening very asymmetrically, that different landowners, different parishes, different justices of the peace are going to interpret this in different ways. Now, the Poor Law acknowledged poverty as a problem and acknowledged a responsibility of care for those in need. It also made steps towards moving poor relief away from being the responsibility of the church. However, because relief was still voluntary and enforcement was inconsistent and varied between parishes, poverty could become very, very bad in poorer areas, or areas where the justice of the peace or the nobility were less interested in helping. So this would be quite a useful example of thinking about the ways in which you can see successes in legislature. So, this is poverty relief in law. This is a good thing, this is a success, this is an awareness that the elites have of a problem that's growing in the country. However, in practice, to what extent was this a success? Well, the answer is really it was limited. For some, I'm sure it helped, but for a lot of people, it didn't have as much of an impact as as it was desired. Okay, let's move on to have a look at continuity and change when it comes to comparing urban and rural society. So we see some continuity for urban societies, that towns remained small and few people lived in them, and employment in towns remained insecure for most. However, we do see some increased opportunity for merchants as domestic industry and change generated income, as seen in the pushing out process. And we also see an increased pressure for resources as monastic hospitals and almshouses closed. So here we see the poor laws coming into effect. When it comes to rural societies, the majority of people still lived in the countryside. The majority of people in England were still employed in agriculture, and rural social division was still persistent. Now, under Henry VIII, we do see some changes. That population growth increased demand for land and food, leading to rises in rent, good for the landlords, not great for the people. We also see enclosure and engrossment cause some increased instability. We also see the dissolution of the monasteries causing major social upheaval, and the putting out system providing some supplementary income for those in rural households. So again, when you're getting a question about some kind of change, particularly social change in England in this period, we can think about England as being a rural place and also being an urban place, that rural England and urban England are really different. They're quite different places. So let's kind of get to the meat of the society section. And this is the rebellions. So there's two key rebellions in this period. The first is the Lincolnshire Rebellion in 1536. It starts in October. It was ultimately quite short, but really a significant rebellion, and happened in the wake of Henry VIII's religious reforms. Now, it collapsed quickly, but revealed widespread anxiety about religious change, and was a serious precursor for the Pilgrimage of Grace, which we're going to go on to have a look at next. Now, there were three key causes for the Lincolnshire uprising. We've got the dissolution of the monasteries, generating social unrest and perceived as an attack on community. We see the loss of monastic charity, combined with rising prices and growing population, that created economic pressure and instability. And we also see a suspicion and mistrust of advisors like Thomas Cromwell, and an intense dislike of the royal commissioners, who were going out and assessing how much land the monasteries have, how much finance, how much property. This was also combined with a distrust and disconnect from Westminster government, that this community feels very far away from the decision making. Now, in early October 1536, a royal commission was sent to enforce religious reforms and assess church wealth. Unrest began to emerge in Louth, but quickly spread across Lincolnshire. Around 30,000 people, predominantly peasants, artisans, and local gentry, began organising, but without any real coherent leadership. Henry VIII acted decisively and mobilised royal forces, sending in the Duke of Suffolk. In the face of military action, a great number of the rebels simply fell away, and local gentry withdrew support. The uprising ultimately disbanded in 2 weeks with no major battles. Arguably, it was reasonably easily crushed because the rebellion lacked leadership and explicit or clear demands. Now, the consequences were that the rebel leaders were executed and royal surveillance of Lincolnshire increased. This reasserted royal power in the region and also prepared the government to take rebellion seriously and prepare for further unrest in the face and depth of religious conservatism. So this takes us on to the Pilgrimage of Grace, which also took place later in October 1536. Now, this was the largest and most serious rebellion of the Tudor period, arguably, that took place mainly in Yorkshire and the north of England. Now, the Pilgrimage of Grace had many of the same causes as the Lincolnshire Uprising. It was resistance to the dissolution of the monasteries and the social structure that they had created and now been destroyed. There's also the loss of monastic charity and the rising population, resulting in economic insecurity, a drop in standard of living, and general social unrest. And then we also see a similar distrust of certain evil councillors and a perception that Henry VIII was being misled, combined with weak royal power in the north and a desire to restore traditional governance. Now, after the Lincolnshire Uprising, rebels began to organise in Yorkshire, and then it grew across much of northern England. A Yorkshire lawyer named Robert Aske emerged as a leader for the agitation. The rebels, at some point numbering between 30,000 and 40,000, became highly organised and disciplined. They swore oaths, bore banners showing religious symbols. They maintained order and did not engage in widespread violence. The rebels quickly took control of York and the strategically important Pontefract Castle. Local nobility and gentry either cooperated with the rebels or failed to resist. They presented the following clear demands: restoration of the monasteries, removal of Cromwell and similar reform-driven ministers, a reversal of religious legislation, and a parliament to be held in the north. They also requested the protection of traditional inheritance and land use. Importantly, the rebels did not seek to overthrow the monarchy, and they repeatedly asserted their loyalty to the king. Their problem wasn't with King Henry VIII, but with the advice that he was being given. Initially, this all went quite well. Henry VIII sent the Duke of Norfolk to negotiate with the rebels. In order to placate them on behalf of the king, he promised a pardon to all those who engaged in the rebellion, a parliament to be held in York, and a consideration of the rebels' grievances. The rebels then disbanded peacefully. Now, unfortunately, this is not the end of the story. In early 1537, unrest briefly re-sparked, and the government then claimed that the rebels had broken their agreement. Leaders like Robert Aske were then arrested and executed. Ultimately, around 200 rebels were eventually executed, and royal authority and power was strengthened in the north with military presence. The Council of the North was also strengthened, and greater surveillance was implemented to monitor northern nobility, sending a clear message that resistance would not be tolerated. The dissolution of the monasteries was then continued and expanded. So here's a bit of an opportunity to think about what Henry VIII's intent was and what his motivations were. So we see an initial placation of the rebels, an acceptance of some of their criticisms. But to what extent was this always the plan? To what extent was this a real acceptance or just an opportunity to kind of quell them before they could completely remove them? That's up to you to decide. Now here we've got a bit of a comparison table comparing the Lincolnshire Rising and the Pilgrimage of Grace. Feel free to pause and read through. I'll just cover the key points. They take place in different areas, but with similar kind of vibes. They're both rural, they're both quite far away from Westminster, and they're both quite Catholic. So that's something that unites these two places. There's a clear difference in organisation. The Lincolnshire rebels were seriously disorganised. There was no clear leadership, and that really impacted the way in which the rebellion went. This compares to the Pilgrimage of Grace rebels in Yorkshire, who were literally led by a lawyer. Like, it was very highly organised, and that was like a key feature in its initial success. We see similarities in government response, that it's very quick. However, in the case of the Rising in Lincolnshire, it was like immediately shut down, potentially quite violently. Whereas in Yorkshire, we see a somewhat acceptance of the rebellion until it turned violent. Now, the significance of the Lincolnshire Rising is more so based on the path it laid for the Pilgrimage of Grace, whereas the Pilgrimage of Grace really posed a serious threat that demanded government response. It's often deemed the most significant of any rebellion in the period, both in its power, its size, and also its very structured intent. So if we look at a bit of change in continuity about rebellions since 1485, we've now looked at this whole period from the start of Henry VII to the end of Henry VIII. Now, if we start with the change, we see that rebellions under Henry VIII are far more ideological and are far less dynastic than they were under Henry VII. This is kind of a suggestion that the Tudor dynasty was at this point very accepted, that the problem wasn't necessarily with the existence of Henry VIII as king, but more about the decisions that he was making. The Pilgrimage of Grace revealed the extent to which rebels posed an increasingly organised threat and required genuine negotiation. Henry VIII was made to negotiate with rebels rather than only use military force, unlike his father, who ultimately usually responded militarily. And also we see that rebellions did not have foreign support in this period, but were much more domestically driven. And again, this comes about because of the domestic problems that were arising in England at the time. Now, continuities, we see that discontent could be worsened by economic pressures and weaknesses in local authority in specific regions. The North-South divide existed under Henry VII and existed under Henry VIII. Rebellions, for the most part, remained quite short-lived and they were always ultimately defeated. That's a strong continuity between the two leaders. The Crown continued to use military force to squash rebellions, and also we see support from nobles was still highly desired by rebels and strategically important. Okay, so if we go back up quickly to have a look at the potential paper questions and past paper questions that we looked at the beginning of the video. If we look at a question like English society was transformed between 1509 and 1547, assess the validity of this view, we can look at the dissolution of the monastery as a really key feature of the way in which English society was transformed. But we can also now complicate this question by thinking about what English society is, because English society was not just one thing. We're thinking about the English elite society, the English rural society, the English urban society. Try and use what we've learned in this video to add a bit of nuance to your answers when you're, applicable for questions about society, but also about all different questions about this period when we're thinking about, the impact of the economy, the impact of foreign relations. Who are we thinking about? Who is being impacted and how? We could also look at questions like religious changes, where the most significant changes take place in the years 1509 to 1547. There's a lot of truth to that statement, I would argue, but we can also see changes in structures of industry, changes in the cloth industry. We also see changes in the standard of living that does come to a degree from the dissolution of the monasteries, but also comes from external factors like population growth. So hopefully this section, it's quite a complicated section, I'd say, of the notes because it brings so many different areas together. But hopefully this gives you a better idea of society in Tudor England under Henry VIII. If you found these revision notes useful, you can find them online at our website at humanitiesexplained.co.uk, where there's many other resources to help you with your Tudor studies. Good luck in your exam, and I'll see you in the next video.